Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Martinez Caro. I participate in the EMO-funded research project together with Angela Downing. We both come from the Complutense University at Madrid. Today we're going to talk about emotion and syntax as part of the Module 2, Grammar and Emotion. Language can be used to transmit factual information. That is, we can use language to talk about the world, to refer to things and people existing in the world. This is what we call the transactional, ideational, or referential function of language. For instance, if we consider the following interaction, what time is it? It's 10 to 3. It is obvious that we are using language to transmit information. However, there is another dimension to language, which is the expressive function of language, by means of which we can use language to talk about our feelings, our emotions, related to the events in the world. This is another very different function to the transactional function of language, and it is one which is very commonly used in real life. In the recent literature, the verbal or linguistic means that fulfill this expressive function are called expressives. It has been only quite recently that other functions different from the referential function of language started to be explored in linguistics. Yet, as we have seen, language is very often used to reflect our system of values and therefore to express our evaluations of people, things, and situations, as well as our emotions. Grammar can be considered the core component of language. We can define grammar very generally as a set of rules which help us see how language works. In its strict sense, grammar covers morphology and syntax. In both, an essential concept is that of structure and also that of hierarchy. In morphology, we basically study how the word is segmented into smaller units, which we call the morphemes. And in syntax, we study how words combine together to form larger units, such as phrases, for instance, like in the garden, or sentences like there is a fox in the garden. Expressivity can be found everywhere in language, in the lexicon, in phonology, morphology, and syntax. In this presentation, as we said before, we're going to focus on syntax and also on morphology as a very related field. Some morphemes have a special emotive or emotional meaning. Emotion and the related concept of evaluation can be expressed in certain endings of words. These endings we call inflections. For instance, in Spanish, certain suffixes have a negative expressive meaning, as we have in the examples in 2, papelajo, mujerzuela, casucha, which we can see the contrast between papel and papelajo, mujer, mujerzuela, and casa, casucha. It is by means of these suffixes that we express the negative orientation related to these words. In Spanish, by contrast, diminutives can have and actually commonly have an evaluative meaning which is positive, as we see in chiquitina and perrito, for instance. In English, too, the suffix "y" in sweetie, for instance, shows affection and closeness. The suffix "y" in certain words may have, however, a pejorative meaning, like in a dodgy plan or this sounds fishy to me. Likewise, the suffix less or full have a negative or positive meaning, respectively, in words like mindless, soulless, tasteless, versus mindful, soulful, tasteful. Compounding, which is another morphological process different from the application of suffixes, the addition of suffixes to roots, to bases of the words, may involve also a pejorative meaning in Spanish. For instance, an example of that is picapleitos, which is a term we use for a pejorative term we use for a lawyer. In English, compounds such as soft-hearted and hard-hearted are opposites with regard to a person being capable or not capable of sympathy, and so oriented towards the positive or the negative, respectively. Finally, a recent article published at La Vanguardia, which is a very prestigious newspaper in Spain, as you know, was entitled De Cincuentonas a Cincuentañeras. The article portrayed an image of 50-year-old women nowadays in Spain as a very positive image, showing, so women showing a positive image, having a lot of confidence in themselves, being intellectually curious, and having a special wisdom that is only gathered through the years. This image of the women in nowadays Spain is very clearly opposed to a stereotype of women in their 50s as well, only a couple of decades ago. And so the author of the article uses these two words, cincuentona and cincuentañeras, which, as we see, only differ in terms of the suffixes that they have, as retaining or explaining this positive versus, in this case, negative versus positive orientation of the image that the author is trying to transmit. I find this a clever example of the opposition between these two terms. Interjections are elements which are on the borderline between morphology and syntax, and they also enter into the domain of lexicology. Interjections are clear examples of expressions of meaning and emotion, so we are interested in them in this course because of that. For instance, the interjection wow in "wow, Bill has a new car" is clearly showing admiration or surprise at the fact that Bill has the new car. Other examples of interjections are, for instance, hey, oh, good gracious, oops, ouch, or yuck. The different meanings that each of these interjection shows are indicated in the information in brackets. Interjections are interesting because perhaps they are the only case of one-to-one correspondence between a particular emotion and a linguistic strategy. For instance, if we say ouch, it is clearly the case that we're going to express pain with that interjection. Or if we utter in English yuck, we would certainly mean disgust. The meaning of interjections, interestingly, may also be metaphorical. For instance, in the following example, in which a teacher in class may say something like, someone has forgotten to hand in their essay, glancing towards a certain student, and the student himself or herself may say, ouch, expressing that he is the one or she is the one who has actually forgotten to hand in the essay. Entering now into the domain of syntax, we see that at the syntactic level, emotion or expressivity, evaluation, and so on, can be manifested by different strategies in syntax. For instance, we may mention here the changing of the usual or expected order of elements in the sentence, which we call constituents, choosing the appropriate sentence type, or using the system of modality, modal verbs in English. We will refer to these first two devices in the following discussion. First, sentence types. We see that by selecting as a particular sentence type in English, or in Spanish for that matter, we can express a general emotive effect. Sentences can be classified generally as declarative, interrogative, imperative, and exclamative. Exclamatives are used to express a statement with a certain exclamatory effect, and are thus particularly suitable for expression emotion. So we are interested in exclamatives in this particular course. For instance, as examples of exclamatives, we may have the following in 10. What a shock they'll have. What a mess he's made with the paint. How I dislike that man. Or we can also have a reduced version of the previous exclamatives. What a shock, what a mess, what an idiot, how dreadful. As you can see, we can also express this kind of exclamation or exclamatory effect by means of more reduced units, so you don't have to actually mention the whole sentence for that. Other sentence types, indeed, can be used with a similar effect. For instance, the interrogative sentence type, which is illustrated in the examples in 11, given a particular intonation associated with them and also a certain context, may be also used with a certain exclamatory effect. For instance, isn't this amazing? "How dare you talk to me like that?" or "Would you believe it?" in which we also find this, as I said, exclamatory effect. In principle, any type of unit, that is not only complete sentences, with the appropriate intonation can express an exclamation and thus a message tinged with emotion. You can't be serious. This is a declarative which, with a certain intonation, as we said before, can be taken for an exclamation in terms of meaning, the meaning that it transmits. Or smaller kind of units like rubbish or the trouble I've had with Jamie. This is a nominal phrase having the word trouble, which is a noun, as head of that unit, can also be used with an exclamatory effect. Declaratives may be enhanced by the use of elements which intensify the meaning of the exclamation, and these are called intensifiers in linguistics. For instance, we have the words such, terribly, and highly as emphasizes of the examples we find in 13. He's such a bore. It's terribly hot. She's highly regarded as an artist. A second device in syntax, which can also express emotivity or expressivity, is to choose a particular order of sentence elements or a special syntactic construction. For instance, if to the question, "How was the meeting?" the answer is, "It was a complete waste of time." This is, saying something about the appreciation of the speaker with respect to how the meeting was, but it is kind of neuter in terms of the meaning it transmits. However, if we say, "A complete waste of time it was," this is more emphatic. In this particular part of the answer, so in B, we find that one constituent of the sentence has been fronted, that is, has been placed at the front of the sentence, and this is what we call fronting. Similarly, in 15, we've got the following contrast. "He told me to run, and I did run." Or, "He told me to run, and run I did," in which we also front, in this case, the lexical verb run. In Spanish, we have similar examples with a similar kind of effect. "Buena tierra es esta," "Miedo me da pensarlo," "De poco te ha servido," "Hasta aquí podíamos llegar." Dijo que se leería el Quijote y el Quijote se leyó. The implication then with these examples is that the sentences in A above present the expected order of elements or constituents, and those in B, by contrast, have an element which has been fronted, adding an emotive, non-basic effect to the meaning expressed by the proposition. Now, so far we have been talking about different devices, syntactic and morphological devices to express emotion, but we haven't said anything about the different emotions that we may associate with these different devices. With respect to morphology and syntax, the kind of emotions and emotive effects that we may express with these devices are emotions such as emphasis, surprise, admiration, unexpectedness, and others. Taking the emotion of emphasis in particular, we find that in the literature, for instance, some scholars have distinguished between two types of emphasis. An emphasis which is more associated with the idea of information highlighting, that is, idea of prominence, idea of reinforcement, and a different kind of emphasis, which is emphasis as expression of evaluation, which is what Quirk et al. Call emotive emphasis, which is particularly concerned with what we are talking about in this course here. Related to the expression of surprise and also to the expression of emphasis is the recently studied phenomenon of mirativity. This has recently attracted much interest in the literature. The general meaning of this phenomenon is one of certain surprise or sudden realization or awareness. More specific definitions of mirativity are speaker's unprepared mind, unexpected new information, and concomitant surprise, or a proposition being newsworthy, unexpected, or surprising. The syntactic construction in Spanish called fronting that we mentioned before, that is involving the placing in initial position of an element which otherwise wouldn't be placed there, may express mirativity apart from other emotions or emotive effects. For instance, in the example, oye, 200 euros me han cobrado. We use the fronting of 200 euros to express surprise at unexpected information, and thus we use this construction to, as a kind of fronting mediative, establishing a contrast with respect to a certain expectation. The contrast here is between expecting something to cost much less and the actual fact of it costing 200 euros, which is a much higher quantity that we expected. In 22, in English, the fronting seems to suggest an emphatic counter to expectation meaning, which is similar to the one we find in 21. We celebrated his success with a special dinner at his favorite restaurant, and a very enjoyable evening it was, I must say. Fronting of negatives in English is also another emphatic device that we can use. For instance, in the famous utterance expressed by Winston Churchill referring to the Battle of Britain in World War II, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Fronting of negatives in English with inversion of subject and operator, that is the first auxiliary we find in the sentence, make for extra emphasis, often accompanied by emotion. For instance, in 24b, not on your life would I tell him the whole story. Or, nowhere else can you find wild orchids, as fine as this. And also, not only at the front of the sentence, but we also may find certain negatives at the end of sentences expressing strong emphasis. Elements such as none or no can be found in those places. Just as well, you've returned the library books today, and none too soon. Other minor syntactic devices that we may find in English and Spanish to express emotion are the following. The use of supplementives, which are non-final clauses, that is, clauses which have a participle, basically, that we find at the usually front or also end position of sentences, which bring into evidence the emotive elements. Things like, moved almost to tears, they dug among the rubble and pulled out a young woman still alive. The use of degree adjectives may also be used with a strong emotive tinge, as in the examples we find in 28. These are examples of noun phrases in which the adjective, the degree adjective, is used as an emphasizer of the following noun: sheer nonsense, mere repetition, utter rubbish, a true genius, absolute folly, a perfect fool, and pure ignorance. Dislocations are elements that we find at the right or left of sentences, and they are typically separated by those with a comma. They can also be associated with the phenomena of affectivity and evaluation. For instance, in 29b, and he not only flew over the fence, he could swim, that pig. Or, he's a cool dude, Sam. Of course, the emphasis here, or the expression of affectivity or emotion, is achieved by the combination of the dislocation with the effect of the evaluative terms. That is, the combination of both dislocation and the use of the evaluative terms, pig, cool, nice, in the examples that we showed. Finally, the expression of emotion and the use of pragmatic markers are also sometimes combined, in English especially. Now, pragmatic markers are elements such as well, or oh, or surely, in the examples that we find in 30, and in some cases, not always, but in some cases, we may also use them to obtain some emotive effects. For instance, well, what a surprise. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. Surely you can find yourself a job. I can't, honestly. Now coming to the summary and conclusions of this presentation. In this part 2 of Module 2, Grammar and Emotion, we have explored how we may express emotion in language by using morphological and syntactic strategies. We have illustrated these strategies with examples from English and Spanish. Remember that morphology and syntax are generally considered the core components of grammar. morphology dealing with the division of words in smaller units that we call morphemes, and syntax dealing with the structure of larger units, the phrases, for example, or higher or larger chunks that we use to form a sentence that we call constituents of that sentence. At the morphological level, certain morphemes can have special emotional meanings. Suffixes, that is, morphological endings of words in English and Spanish, are typically associated with a positive or negative evaluation of the thing or person we're talking about. For instance, we saw the contrast in Spanish between the terms cincuentona, negatively oriented, in contrast to cincuentañera, positively oriented. On the borderline between morphology and syntax, and also related to the field of lexicology, that is, the study of the vocabulary of a language, we have interjections, which provide a clear and often unequivocal expression of certain emotions. For instance, oops, in English, is generally understood as indicating a recognition of one's slight mishap or mistake. At the syntactic level, we have seen how the use of a sentence type, a special order of words or constituents in the sentence, and other minor syntactic devices such as the use of supplementives, dislocations, and pragmatic markers can be exploited for emotive effects. With respect to sentence types, exclamatives in particular have been presented as closely associated with expressing a statement with a certain emphatic or emotive effect, generally reflecting a positive or negative orientation. In the section on order of sentence elements, we have seen how the fronting construction, which brings to the front of the sentence an element which is generally presented elsewhere, is often related to creating emotive and emphatic effects to the message transmitted by that sentence or utterance. The emotion and emotive effects that underlie the use of an unexpected syntactic order are those of emphasis, surprise, admiration, unexpectedness, and others. In the recent literature, there has been an interest in the phenomenon of mirativity, which comprises the idea of sudden realization, unexpected new information, or concomitant surprise. Fronting in Spanish can sometimes express mirativity, as in oye, 200 euros me han cobrado. And these are the references I have mentioned in our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.